this is the start of the Chatham House session 5 in their virtual conference, Iraq Navigating Reform, Collapse, and the Status Quo. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jane Araf. I'm international correspondent for NPR, the US radio network covering Iraq, Egypt, and other countries. Starting next week, I'll be joining the New York Times as Baghdad bureau chief. I've covered Iraq since 1991, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have such engaging and knowledgeable panelists. Just a few notes before we get into it. This session is going to be held on the record, and it will be recorded. There will be simultaneous translation in Arabic and English with the wonderful interpreters of Chatham House. You can choose the language channel in the little panel at the bottom. If you choose off, that will give you both Arabic and English, the source language. If you would like translation when our Arabic speakers are speaking English, choose English. And if you would like translation, vice versa, you can choose Arabic. Questions. We love questions, and we will take lots of them after hearing from the panelists. You can submit the questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and you can submit them anytime a question occurs to you. And that's it for the technical part. So let me tell you about the speakers. First, we have Ahlam Alami, who is a lawyer and the former head of the Iraqi Bar Association. Ms. Ahlam Alami has been a lawyer since 1998, and she's currently the Prime Minister's spokesman on law. She became a member of the Iraqi Bar Association in 2006. In 2013, she became deputy head of the association and was later elected president. Interestingly, Ms. Alami is also a member of the governmental expert group working on the implementation of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. She's received awards and honors for her work in the legal field, including Best Female Lawyer from the Iraqi Bar Association, and she's been honored by the General Secretariat of the Arab Lawyers Union. We have Zaid Al-Ali, Senior Program Officer in Constitution Building in Africa and West Asia, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Zaid has previously taught law at Sciences Po in Paris and at Princeton University. From 2019 to 2020, he was a fellow at the Berlin Institute of Advanced Studies. He's practiced international commercial arbitration for 12 years and worked for the UN on Iraqi constitutional and parliamentary reform for 5 years. Zaid has implemented projects on and provided assistance to the large majority of constitutional reform initiatives in Arab countries. He's also overseen establishment of the Arab Association of Constitutional Law, the region's first regional network of constitutional experts. And we have Belkis Villay, senior researcher at the Crisis and Conflict Division of Human Rights Watch. Belkis has worked with Human Rights Watch for the last 8 years. She became the Iraq senior researcher for the organization in 2016, and she spent years monitoring the criminal justice system. Since January, she's taken up a second role with Human Rights Watch in the Crisis and Conflict Division. You know, a lot of the things you deal with, they're absolutely the dark side of the Iraqi justice system: torture, capital punishment, and these are issues that have not really gone away since 2003, and of course existed before 2003. But I wanted to ask you, you know, Iraq in many ways is a traumatized society. And a lot of the people I talk to, I get the sense that what they want is vengeance, perhaps more than justice. Do you feel that is the case, and is that an impediment to reform?
Thank you for putting that question to me. I think it is a very interesting one, and one that comes up a lot in discussions around what justice should look like, particularly in the aftermath of ISIS. You know, I can remember very well when the international community was discussing in 2016, early 2017, what they were calling a transitional justice landscape in Iraq. And I remember very senior officials within the international community saying, you know, Iraqis want revenge. They're not really interested in rule of law. An eye for an eye And there isn't really room to have discussions about other ways of addressing anger and grievance. And at the time, I fundamentally disagreed with that. Yes, of course, within tribal customs, there is an element of that, but I don't think that's the whole picture. And what I think is really interesting to watch is how since then things have changed, things have developed, and the best example I can think of is in Anbar in 2016. You had a decision taken by tribal leadership to create a process now known as tabriya, by which a family member can go to court and essentially use the courtroom and use the judge as a witness to distance themselves from the crimes of ISIS. So what they're doing in a technical legal sense is that they're opening a criminal complaint against their husband, their son, their father. They're saying, I'm making a complaint against them that they were a member of ISIS, but I had nothing to do with the crime. And I'm sorry for the crimes that were committed by my loved one. And then the court gives them a document, and that document facilitates their access to the process known as security clearance, and ultimately that allows them to get access to their civil documentation. Now, there are of course concerns with this process. No one should be forced to open a criminal complaint simply to have their basic rights met. But it tells me something else, which I think is quite interesting, which is that within Iraqi society, there is a desire to see apologies, to see truth telling, to see people coming forward, explaining what they did or didn't do, and essentially asking for forgiveness from, in this case, it's a judge in a courtroom. But I do think, and I've heard this from many victims communities, they also want apologies for crimes that some individuals didn't participate in, but stood by and watched. And again, I think this is really interesting and something, unfortunately, where the international community has really failed to engage in. To what extent can we help create fora in which you can have grievances met in other ways?
It's really interesting, and I'd love to come back to that issue of how tribal law sometimes overlaps and sometimes contradicts general rule of law. And also, once we get Ahlam back, and I hope we will, I'd love to talk more about how the legal system does or doesn't serve women as well. But Zaid, if we could turn to you. You wrote a book called The Struggle for Iraq's Future: How Corruption, Incompetence, and Sectarianism Have Undermined Democracy. It seems sometimes that those things are intertwined. And if you're even like an Iraqi citizen at a ministry trying to get basic documents or something, it's hard to tell which of those three are preventing you from doing that. But in the end, they have almost the same effect, I suppose, of undermining the underpinnings of the state. Do you feel that they're related, corruption, incompetence, and sectarianism? And do you feel they've abated since you wrote that?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for that, and thanks to Chatham House for organizing this event. So, how they abated? I would say that sectarianism hasn't been like a huge problem, like on a neighborhood basis, right? It's not a community problem, at least in most parts of Iraq. It can be when it's operationalized or weaponized, but on a neighborhood or community basis in most parts of Baghdad or other mixed cities, the problem isn't people being from one community or another and not being able to communicate or to interact with other people. That isn't the real problem. The problem is sectarianism in the upper echelons of government, in parliament particularly, and in other state bodies. Parliament is possibly the most unpopular institution in the state, in the Iraqi state, and it's the only one that's nationally directly elected. And part of the reason why that is because they only see things in terms of sectarianism in parliament. So, for example, I don't know if listeners followed, but last year after the protests broke out, at the end of last year, one of the things that happened is that the parliament put together a constitutional revision committee with a view to amending the constitution to bring it more in line with, theoretically, with what the general population was asking for. And the committee was composed exclusively on sectarian lines. So they made sure, they were very, very careful to make sure that they had the exact right number of Shias and Sunnis and Kurds and Christians, et cetera, which is really silly given what was happening in the streets. That wasn't at all what people were asking for in the streets. And then in terms of the substance of what it was that the committee started talking about, they were only talking about issues that were of sectarian concern, right? So things like the relationship between the KRG and Baghdad, which are big constitutional issues, of course, but that wasn't, once again, what people were protesting about. People were protesting about the relationship between the individual and the state, corruption, and so on and so forth. So the way in which they've evolved is a very strange evolution. On the one hand, Parliament and senior state officials can't see past this problem. That's all they see. All they see is everything in terms of ethno-sectarian colors. The general population, not all of them, of course, because of people living in very different circumstances, but the people who are on the streets and demanding change have gone way past that and are demanding for the establishment of a new social contract. But there's just no interaction between their vision and the vision of the political class. So to a large extent, I mean, the answer has to be a more complex one than as to whether or not we moved on or not. It's just some people have, some people haven't, but the evolution is a very strange one.
Lovely. We're going to see if we have Ahlam with us. Is it Ahlam? Are you back with us again? Okay, we will try to get back to her. We desperately want to talk to Ahlam. She is in really a unique position as having been involved at the most senior members of the legal profession in Iraq. In the meantime, let's mix things up a bit and go to a question and reward the very first person to have asked a question, Hiwa Mahmoud Qadir, who asks, what's the meaning of law and justice if there is the effect of entities and political parties on the judgment process? What are the means to prevent it and keep it free? Which I imagine, if we were to summarize, means how can you ever make progress on establishing rule of law if political parties and other political entities have such a hold on a country? Belkis?
I mean, the question, of course, is getting at a very specific point, and one I unfortunately have to agree with. I would say I've been quite amazed in my time in Iraq, sitting in courtrooms and engaging with judges at, on the one hand, the incredibly high level of capacity and training and professionalism that I've come across from judges. But at the same time, the one thing that seems to be impeding the proper functioning of courts and the rule of law, which is this intrusion of political interests. And, you know, with judges that I've been able to develop a relationship with and been able to sort of speak to in a candid manner, they're fully aware of how these influences are affecting the ability to met out justice. And they have no lack of knowledge when it comes to international human rights standards, for example. They don't have a lack of knowledge when it comes to the Iraqi constitution and legal provisions and the protections that they afford. But in conversations I have with them, particularly when we talk about things like justice for extrajudicial killings, for example, of protesters, for enforced disappearances, for arbitrary detention, they always bring up at some point in the conversation, Belkis, you know the political reality that we're working in. And if I, as a judge, were to essentially do what the law tells me to and ignore these political interests, I would be punished. I would be transferred to another courthouse. I would be demoted. And unfortunately, we've seen that. I've spoken to many judges who have over the years been moved from courthouse to courthouse in an effort to punish them for abiding by the law. So this really is, I think, the key thing that is holding back the Iraqi justice system from fulfilling its mandate.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about the ISIS trials a bit. Let's just see if we have Ahlam back with us. Ahlam, can you hear us? Ahlam in Baghdad is former president of the Iraqi Bar Association, and we're just trying to overcome a few communications issues as she's in Baghdad. Ahlam? Okay, we'll keep trying on that end. The ISIS trials. it was supposed to be part of a process of reconciliation. We've seen executions increasing. I've been able to sit in on some of those trials, and Belkis, as you've pointed out in some of your reports, there are parts of the trials that are quite concerning. So perhaps we could talk about that part first. Give us your assessment of those trials and whether they further the rule of law or actually undermine it.
The picture is incredibly bleak, as you said, and that comes from my time sitting in investigative hearings and at the trial stage in different court rooms across Iraq. Most of my research has focused on trials under terrorism, counterterrorism legislation. So in specific people being accused of being members of ISIS. The one big thing you realize the second you walk into the courtroom is that basic due process rights are not being respected. Defendants are not afforded any of the rights you would expect, including to a proper legal defense, not being tortured, not being held in degrading prison conditions, etc. But I think what's also incredibly important to note here is when it comes to the victims of ISIS abuses. Victims of ISIS have absolutely no room in these proceedings. And that I think is particularly egregious given how serious the crimes were that were committed. And the reason, if we want to boil it down to one single reason, but the reason this is the case is because the Iraqi state has chosen to prosecute everyone linked to ISIS under this framework of terrorism, as opposed to conducting investigations into the individual and specific violent crimes that have been committed. If the state was to do that, investigate a specific rape, a specific killing, they would be required to interview witnesses and to bring in victims and witnesses to the courtroom. But because they're simply using the terrorism framework, a confession from someone beaten until they say, yes, I was a member of ISIS, is sufficient for the proceedings to move through trial, and so the grave injustice being done in the courtroom in these cases is not just to the defendant, but is specifically to the victims. There are two bright spots. I think I'll bring them up later in the conversation if there's room. We are seeing a little bit of progress in two specific chambers that gives me hope that at least some judges are trying to push the envelope and better comply with basic rights of defendants.
Wonderful. Zaid, do you feel it's a realistic scenario, a judicial system in Iraq in which there would be proper investigations done, in which people would actually have confidence in the rule of law? Let's start with whether that would apply to things like the ISIS trials, in your view.
And it's not currently happening, as Belkis said, and the likelihood that it's going to happen, on the ISIS trials is very, very remote currently. And if you're going to look past that, think about the rule of law generally. To go back to Hiwa's question and Belkis's answer to it as well. Chances are also very remote, and the reason why, there are all sorts of different reasons why. But and just to add my thoughts to that is that what we have currently in Iraq is we have a system of government where whereas previously we had a hyper-presidential system of government where all power was vested in a single person. Now all power is vested in a single institution, which is Parliament, right? And Parliament has all the authority in the country, and that's a problem because Parliament is not populated by democratic forces. Most political parties in Iraq are not democratic. They're family-based enterprises, and that's in the best case scenario. And so when you have that type of situation, and there's political parties that are in Parliament don't really have any interest in establishing the rule of law or in establishing a democratic system. Their interest is simply just to remain in Parliament and to remain in power for its own sake. Then the possibilities that they're going to establish the rule of law is very, very remote. And then also just to add another element. So Belkis mentioned that she's been interacting with judges who are trying their best to push the envelope, which is I think the term that she used, and that sounds terrific. However, there are other judges that are not trying to do that. And there's also another problem, and it would be interesting to hear what Bakis hears about this and what others think too, which is that many judges don't consider that it's their role to apply the rule of law or to make sure that due process rights are protected and enforced. Many judges see it as being their role to protect the state from individuals, to protect the state from security risks. They see themselves as being part of the state, right? They see themselves as being a state service, right? And threats to the state are threats to themselves. And so in many cases, what you see is you have judges who have absolutely no sympathy for defendants. As soon as they look at them, just the mere sight of a defendant makes their stomach churn. That's only, I'm not speaking in absolute terms, it applies to a lot of them, but that's a cultural problem that exists within the judiciary. It exists in lots of court systems around the world. It's not a uniquely Iraqi problem, but the problem does exist in Iraq. I would say it's probably more acute in Iraq than in other places. And so far, to my knowledge, there's been very little effort to resolve this on an institutional basis. In order for that sort of thing to happen, it would either have to happen from within the judiciary, and so therefore the judiciary's leadership, or from parliament through legislation. Parliament's not going to do it, and the judiciary's leadership is also not going to do it for the reasons that Bilquis mentioned before. So it's really left to the individual. So if an individual judge wants to do good, then they can try to do so at their own peril. But otherwise, the institution and the state will not help. So those are my elements of response to that question.
Wonderful, thank you. We're still trying to reach Ahlam al-Lami in Baghdad. In the meantime, we have some wonderful, thoughtful questions. Here's one from Haider al-Shakri. He says, there have been tremendous efforts by the UN and international organizations to promote rule of law and access to justice in Iraq. Do the panelists think they're effective? And in their opinion, what should the international community focus on if they want to help Iraq in securing justice and rule of law? And that's an interesting question, because I think we've all seen endless workshops and money poured into rule of law by the US and by other countries. Have they had any effect? Zaid, let's start with you.
They had some effect. I mean, it's impossible to speak once again in absolute terms and say that all of them were useless, But broadly speaking, given the enormous amounts of money and effort that was invested in, training and workshops and reporting and so on and so forth, the outcome is pretty grim. It's not a good situation that we're in. So, broadly speaking, were they absolutely useless? No. But was it worth everything that was done? I don't know. It's really, really hard to say. And in terms of what else can be done, it's really, really a difficult question. The alternatives include, for example, turning Iraq into a pariah state, for calling it out for the incredible amounts of human rights abuses that take place in detention and prisons and so on and so forth, the random arrests, the disappearances, torture on a serial basis, that probably wouldn't help the bulk of the Iraqi population. They wouldn't help them at all, probably. It would probably just take them back to an even darker period. Something else would be to possibly just punish individuals who are involved in these blatant violations. And that takes us back to, for example, the protest movement that took place last year, which is theoretically still ongoing, but the bulk of the protests are over now, and the incredible violence that was exacted on the protesters. I mean, obviously, there's an argument that they were also not entirely peaceful, and that's not completely wrong. But the amounts of violence that were exacted upon these people, I mean, and the way in which it was done was just absolutely horrific. And the almost total absence of accountability for the actions that were taken. There are people who are in authority today in Iraq who are known and by name, and it's very well known that they played a role in participating and orchestrating the violence that was exacted upon those people. And yet they're, very much part of the international regional community, and they travel and they go about their business and so on and so forth. And that shouldn't be, right? So, to the extent that Iraqi justice cannot hold these people accountable, then perhaps the international community should do a little bit more than just reporting, and perhaps also try to hold some of these people accounting by freezing funds and making their lives miserable as well, which is something that can happen, and also perhaps increasing. So maybe that's something. It's hard to say, but at least something that perhaps people can think about.
Thanks so much. I think we have back with us Ahlam Alami in Baghdad, the former head of the Iraqi Bar Association. Ahlam, can you hear me? Ahlam? Okay, we have a picture. We're just trying to get the sound, and I know we have people working on that, so we'll come back to Ahlam. Belkis, there is a question here that deals with quite a lot of the reporting you've done. It's from Rosanna Lavoir, and she asks, could we talk a little bit about justice for children, including those suspected of ISIS affiliation and detainees? International law emphasizes the importance of rehabilitation and reintegration. What options or hopes do you see to fulfill that?
This is such an important question, and really it's about the framing of the discussion of children who were recruited by ISIS. We have seen not only within the space of the justice system and within the prosecutions, where children are being treated as adults are being treated when it comes to recruitment or joining ISIS. In fact, the criminal age for responsibility in Iraq is age 9. And I've seen young kids, 13, 14 years old, being prosecuted for that affiliation. But unfortunately, I've even heard very prominent diplomats in the international community, others who should know better, who have been posted, for example, in countries in Africa where child soldiers at age 8, were given a machete and forced to hack their parents to death, and then joined a fighting group and go into the jungle for years and years. Those kids were afforded the time and space and healing and resource to be rehabilitated and to go back to a normal life when possible. And the international community, as well as their governments, were invested in that. In Iraq, you see none of that. And as I mentioned, I've even heard international diplomats parroting back to me this line of, well, but Belkis, the 9-year-old kid who had munitions strapped on him, who could have blown up at a checkpoint in Kirkuk, we need to treat these as criminals. And that really flies in the face of absolutely everything that international law says. And again, the numerous examples we have of child soldier recruitment across the world and the way to address that. And I can say, having spoken to a lot of children sitting in detention for ISIS affiliation, when you ask them why they joined ISIS, what they tell you is exactly what kids everywhere else in any other context are telling you. I joined because I wanted to try and make money for my family, or I joined because my brother was doing it and I thought that's what we should do. I wanted to look cool in front of my cousin. The basic reasons, none of which are about ideology and religious training, whether interpreted rightly or wrongly. It really these are kids, and they should be treated as kids. And I think that the Iraqi treatment of these children now is really going to have long-term consequences. Under Iraqi law, these children are not going to be getting the death penalty nor the life sentence. So they will get released after many, many years in prison, during which time they were given 0 opportunities to continue their education or to get any kind of rehabilitation programming. And the kids that I've met, I would add, are generally severely traumatized and in need of significant psychosocial supports.
Let's just try to go back to Baghdad to Ahlam Alami. I think we're still working on that one. Belkis, there's a really interesting question from Salman Mustafa, who says, as an Iraqi citizen, I don't believe that my rights are protected by laws and regulations in this country. And Salman goes on to say that particularly Iraqi minorities, LGBT individuals, and others are facing laws that address them as the criminals. Do you feel that is a major problem in Iraq?
The Iraqi penal code criminalizes what should be criminal, in terms of acts, but there definitely are not enough protections for specific vulnerable groups. And more of my work has been focused on women victims of domestic violence. And there we see the same thing, which is that, yes, the penal code protects against things like assault, rape, killing, things like that. Ultimately, you would need much more forceful legislation to protect vulnerable groups from specific acts being done against them where the penal code is not providing that protection. And as is pointed out, of course, when it comes to LGBT rights, we see that concern. There are numerous individuals across Iraq in the last years who have been killed simply for being seen as LGBT by their community, and many dozens more who have been receiving threatening phone calls, social media campaigns against them, and have had to flee the country. So absolutely, that is correct.
We're still trying to reach Ahlam Alami. I think we're trying to reach her on the phone at this point because we really do want to hear what she has to say from inside the legal system. And we know that she's trying to talk to us, and we will keep trying to get her. Zaid, let me ask you about one of the big underpinnings of all this, which is the Constitution. You know, everyone always blames the Constitution for pretty much everything, vaguely worded, no one can understand it, everyone has a different interpretation. Is it that bad? And if so, why is it that bad?
Okay, well, so the Constitution, I mean, so it's not a great document, let's put it that way. That's the first thing. The basic underpinnings of the state, meaning the basic principles of the Constitution, are probably sound, meaning that, you know, the Constitution provides for the existence of a federal system of government and also provides for a parliamentary system. So, I mean, so those are like in terms of the general principles of, you know, how the state should be organized, and also provides for, you know, a Bill of Rights, which is basically okay. I mean, there's some problems with some of the provisions here and there, but broadly speaking, it's okay, right? But there are some serious problems in the text. So in terms of the detail of what it says. So I mean, I know that it's not the subject of this conversation, but I'll steer back to the substance in a second, the substance of this panel in a second. But the thing that everyone points to immediately is the system for the federal system, and the incredible lack of detail in the Constitution on how the federal system is going to operate. And the reason why there isn't the sufficient amount of detail is because there is no agreement in Iraq on federalism. And this Constitution was pushed through without a genuine agreement. You know, of course, you know, we can talk about the referendum and, you know, the amount of approval that the Constitution received in the referendum, but no one reads constitutions before they're put to a referendum. They don't read them in Europe, and they certainly don't read them in Iraq or anywhere else, right? People vote just on the general process without really knowing what's in the text, right? So, you know, the referendum doesn't signify a genuine agreement between people. But on this specific issue, about the issues that we're talking about today, meaning, you know, the judiciary, rule of law, you know, the individual rights, and so on and so forth, there the Constitution is also highly dysfunctional. And the reason why that is because the Constitution establishes some institutions. So, for example, the Judicial Institute, the Judicial Council, Supreme Court, Federal Supreme Court, so on and so forth. There's very little detail in the Constitution on how those individual institutions are supposed to operate, and all of the detail is left to Parliament. And that would be okay if Parliament was a democratic institution, but if it's only populated by family-run enterprises where people are just trying to cling to power for its own sake, then that doesn't really help anyone. What it means is that you're handing over control over all of these institutions to political parties who aren't interested in investing them for the interests of the people. And that's basically why we're in the situation that we're in, which is that, you know, we're not, none of the laws that are going to be passed are going to be passed with the interests of the people in mind if the lawmaker is not democratic.
So to that point of passing laws and their impact on rule of law, we've recently heard from Cleric Muqtada Sadr, that he may actually be fielding candidates in the elections again. This election was to be an election of reform, an election that would usher in a new Iraq. What do you think would be the impact if we're seeing, for instance, the Sadr movement back in parliament? And what are the chances, do you think, that this will be a different kind of parliament? Because as you've described in various answers, it is the source of much of what seems to be dysfunction in Iraq.
I mean, unless something major happens, like some major event that's going to really change things, there won't be any differences in the next parliament. The parliament will be almost exactly the same. I mean, some of the individuals may change. There may be some turnover, and there may be like even 50% turnover, but the broad makeup of parliament won't change. All the political parties that are currently in parliament will run again. Certainly, there's absolutely no surprise that the centrist movement is going to run. All of the others are going to run as well. And they won't be held accountable for all of the violations that they always carry out, which is, blatant violation of electoral rules that they always engage in. So like, bribery and fraud and so on and so forth, that happens every electoral cycle. There's, that's always been the problem with Iraq's electoral system. And that's always been the problem with Iraq's constitutional system, which is that there's no accountability for the big decision makers in the country. They can do whatever they want. And sometimes, a specific individual will be cast out to the wolves as a sacrifice to the people. But that's not even done as a form of accountability. That's just done because that specific individual has lost their value. The next parliament will be exactly the same as the current one. There are some individuals may change, but there's absolutely no reason to assume that there's going to be any change. These changes in the electoral system are by and large, they're superficial. And they might actually, in some respects, make things worse. What was really wrong with the electoral system, which is the total absence of accountability mechanisms for violations of electoral rules, is still there. There still is no accountability system. There's this, people can engage as much fraud as they want. There's not going to be any accountability for them.
That is a pretty grim prognosis. We'll get back to that. Yeah. Right now, let's check in with Ahlam Alami. Can you hear us?
هسه واضح الصوت؟
واضح الصوت؟ Fantastic. How wonderful. We are so happy to have you back with us. I wanted to ask you first, since you are the former head of the Iraqi Bar Association, you're in the heart of the justice system. One of the big problems has been that it isn't exactly safe to be a judge or a lawyer. There have been attacks, there have been killings. Is that of concern to you? Is it still dangerous to practice the profession honorably, let's say?
واضح الصوت؟ الحمد لله. اعتذر على هذا. طبعا انا مذنب بذنب الانترنت، هذا مشكله الانترنت في هذا الوقت. انا اعتذر جدا. طبعا انا استمعت الى معظم الحديث اللي حصل. اتفق في كثير من عنده، اتفق في اهم مساله تم طرحها في هذا الحديث، انه المشكله تكمن في الدستور العراقي. الدستور العراقي كانت هناك به عدة مشاكل. هذه المشاكل ما زلنا نعاني منها كعراقيين، وحتى جميع الأنظمة، إن كانت النظام القضائي أو أي نظام أو حتى نظام الانتخابات. فكل هذه المشاكل هي بسبب هذا الدستور الذي نظم على عجالة، وما زلنا كعراقيين نعاني منه.
It was not matured. We all suffered and struggled from it. I do agree by large with a lot of what has been discussed. When it comes to the tribes, certainly with the tribal issues is stipulated within the constitution. The Iraqi constitution mentions it. However, it has empowered the tribal leaders and the tribal figures. So it enabled them sometimes to be even above the law in Iraq. I do agree by large with this premise, many of the outlaws and those instigators who commit crimes and violations, they commit whatever they wish, and then they get protection and impunity by their tribes. So as we know, in many regions, the key actors and the main players in these regions are tribes themselves, and they are beyond the accountability and the command of government, where government falls short of even fulfill its judiciary mandate within these regions, since criminals and wanted personals are enjoying the protection and the immunity of the tribal communities, regardless of the crimes they commit. When it comes to in this particular time for us as Iraqi, we can't I mean, the punishment of death, we can't, I mean, forfeit it right now. We need it, whether it is, I mean, the execution when it comes to ISIS members and those who or those who have uncontrolled weapons and arms. So if we forfeit and give away the execution punishment at this particular time in Iraq, we would be jeopardizing our interest, and we will be going to a really dangerous brink. It's not yet about time in Iraq to abolish the executions. Still, we have a lot of weapons out of control of out of the command of the state, which is rather weak, because I have to acknowledge, we have to know that the state is still short of protecting the Iraqi people. Still, we are seeing many powerful and influential political parties. The judiciary system itself, I mean, all the judges as individuals are under significant pressure whenever they try or they attempt to put in place some provisions or some laws. They are subject to different intimidation and threats. The same applies to lawyers and to barristers, and many times we confront the situation where a lawyer is being threatened by its tribal community.
Ahlam, do we still have you with us? Wonderful. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask, you know, I keep seeing Iraqis here, talking to Iraqis who have relatives in jail, for instance, who should have been released. They're not released because they're supposed to pay bribes. And that element of corruption, which you are involved in trying to fight, seems to be throughout the justice system. How much of a problem is corruption, do you think, in the legal system and the justice system?
The reform within the judiciary system, it needs a lot of legislations to be revised, I mean, because still we have many outdated bills and legislations in Iraq. So a lot of these needs to be addressed and revised and rethought. Certainly, we have a parliament which is not in harmony, I mean, is lacking harmony, and is not functioning on behalf and in the best interest of the Iraqi people. So possibly a lot of the articles and the provisions within the legal atmosphere needs to be revised and adapted in light with the current reality, and in order to serve the best of people's interest. And the reason why it took long time to have a decisive change and reform within the judiciary and the legal system, we really need to do a lot of revision and adaptation So sometimes it takes a miracle in order to change a law in Iraq and to revise it. So I'm afraid it's not easy for us to put forward legislations on behalf and in favor of the Iraqi people.
And sorry, how bad do you think is the problem of corruption within the legal system and within the justice system?
We can't say there is corruption within any judiciary system because as lawyers, we can't talk without building on evidence. We should be evidence-based. I mean, in total, the question is, if we wanted to say there is corruption, probably there might be some corruption within the executive establishments, probably at the end of those entities which are in control of detentions, for instance, sometimes those who lacks the enough professionality in order to be equipped and qualified to carry on any detention processes or so perhaps we might blame, I mean, those executive institutions. For instance, police officers or army officers, when they go for a detention of any person or try to capture anyone, probably they will try to put any accusation. It might lack the legal validity. So perhaps they will put their institutions in an awkward position if they try to, I mean, fabricate certain charges against. I'm a good follower of the judiciary decisions. Certainly, many of the cases at this time are being disputed and challenged, by the way, due to lack of, I mean, due processes and due legal process, certainly within the court of cassation and similar cases. At many times, there is a significant lack of evidence, but perhaps, yeah, I won't rule out that there is a corruption within the judiciary system, but it might be more relevant to the executive bodies of the judiciary system. So yeah, sometimes fabrication might happen against some individuals who might be victims of those, I mean, law enforcement bodies.
Thank you. Let's go to a question. Here's one from Thanasis Kambanis. One of the questions he asks is, what has become of convicted ISIS members who were sentenced to death? Have the executions been indefinitely delayed? And how problematic is it implementing the death penalty? How problematic is the implementation? Belkis, I'd like to ask you about that, but first, if we could hear from Ahlam. Ahlam, sorry, the question was. Yep. The question is, it's from someone in the audience. What has happened to the ISIS members who were sentenced to death? We have recently heard that there has been an increase in carrying out the death penalty. Were those accused, convicted ISIS members?
I'm not sure she was able to hear me. I've translated this 2 times.
Okay, we can go back to that one. Belkis, do you have any thoughts on that one? This rise in executions we have seen and the expected executions to come, do those seem to be ISIS convictions?
So to the first question of yours, Thanasis, is that we're seeing definitely that executions are being carried out. أهلا إذا بدك تردي بالأول.
شكرا ست بلقيس. اتصور انه تم
Thank
تنفيذ
you very
اعمال
much,
بعدها، يعني احنا من
Balkis.
خلال
I
ما
believe
نرى
that many
على
executions
قنوات
have been
التلفزيون في فتره
performed
واخرى
already,
انه تم تنفيذ
executed many
حكم الاعدام
times.
في بعض
We see on
المراجع.
TV
هناك
that
يتم
some
تنفيذ حكم
executions
الاعدام.
have been carried
حكم
out
الاعدام انا
for
بس احب اوضح
ISIS members.
مساله
Let me clarify a
اذا
point
سمحت
here
لي،
when
انه
it comes
حكم
to
الاعدام ينفذ
executions.
من وزاره العدل، مو
Execution
من
is
قبل
being
القضاء. يعني
implemented
عندكم هذه
by the
المعلومه
Ministry
ولا
of
لا؟
Justice
انه
and not by
بعدما ان
the
تنفذ
judiciary system.
بعد أن تنفذ
So
بعد أن
after
تصدر القرارات
following
القضائية
the
يتم
decisions from
التنفيذ من قبل
the
وزارة العدل
verdicts from
وليس
the
من
judiciary
وليس
system,
من
it is
النقابة
the
القضائية.
Ministry of
يعني السلطة
Justice who will
المختصة
carry
بتنفيذ
out the
الإعدام
implementation
من
of these
وزارة العدل بعد أن
executions.
يتم
So
اكتساب
it
القرار
needs to
الدولي
be
والتنفيذ.
handled
في
by
الوقت
the Ministry
الحالي
of
نحن
Justice.
نسمع بأن
At
هناك
the current
بالفترة الأخيرة
time,
يتم تنفيذ
we
حكم
hear,
الإعدام.
we know from
هناك
time to
تم
time
تنفيذ
that
حكم
there are
الإعدام
many
بالفعل.
executions being carried out.
تفضلي ست بلقيس.
And I think this gets
Yes.
an issue of concern. You know, in 2014, if I remember correctly, the Ministry of Justice made a clear decision to no longer publish the numbers of executions that were being carried out. So since 2014, you don't see regular updates on their website when executions are carried out. And we're sort of working in a black box where, you know, maybe because of information from a specific prison guard, we'll find out that executions took place, including last week information that 21 people had been executed. But overall, the government is refusing to share publicly statistics when it's actually carrying out the death penalty. And just to the second part of the question, you know, the death penalty in and of itself is a punishment of concern. To us as an organization, to many in the human rights movement, and to more and more countries that are banning its use. But I think particularly in Iraq, when you're talking about trials with such serious due process violations, if someone didn't have any access to a proper defense, if someone was tortured until they made a confession, these kind of abuses mean that you may well be executing individuals, the Iraqi state may well be executing individuals who perhaps didn't even commit the crime that they're being accused of. And given the flaws in the way trials proceed, I don't think anyone should have confidence when someone is convicted that we're sure that they committed those crimes. And so I think given those due process concerns, the application of the death penalty in Iraq is particularly concerning.
Ahlam, let me ask you about that. As Belkis said, there are serious questions about whether those who are convicted and sentenced to death in Iraq are actually guilty. Do you believe that's the case, that the flaws in the system are so great they might be putting to death innocent people?
اوكي هسه واضح؟
نعم.
صدر قانون العفو.
There has been an amnesty bill, amnesty law, which has been issued. The most recent amnesty law has mentioned that a retrial might be really pursued in certain cases. And to the best of my information, and I'm sure you know that the most recent amnesty law, I don't have the specific date of it. However, it has been allowed for the family members and relatives of those convicted by death penalty, to be retrialed based on a request through a lawyer, and whether the judiciary system has accepted this and found enough considerations. And I think the reason for this, they have realized that many of the issues related to the procedures, related to the detention and to the arresting, has been increasingly flawed. And many of the decisions of retrial, many decisions have been reversed. I mean, when it comes whether to life, prison, or death penalty, has been cancelled at many cases. And so many, I mean, verdicts and judgments has been mistakenly made. And this is why many cases have been allowed to be retrialed based on a new evidence.
Thank you. Zaid, I wonder if you want to tackle this question, and any our other panelists, please feel free to answer as well. It's from Ruba Al-Hassani, who asks in part, she says, in interviews with lawyers in Iraq, she is told that militias are heavily involved in the legal system. Zaid, do you feel that's a problem?
I mean, obviously, if there are militias who are involved in the legal system, then obviously it's a huge problem. If the question is to what extent are they involved?
Yes.
I mean, they're certainly involved. They're certainly involved in some and lots of in certain types of disputes. I would say I don't think it would be fair to characterize the legal system as being so under the influence of militias that they're involved in everything. That wouldn't be right. That would be an exaggeration. But they have interests in specific disputes, and they'll use the force at their disposal to try to influence the outcome. There's no question, that's absolutely a problem. And it's not just militias; it's political parties who, some of which have militias as well. So it's it's definitely an issue, and it goes back to the same problem, which is what is this? What is the state that we have? What is the nature of the state? What is it designed to achieve, and who is it for? It certainly doesn't feel like it's for the citizen. It certainly doesn't feel like the state is there to serve and to allow for Iraqis to thrive. What it feels like is it's there to allow for a small number of undemocratic political parties to capture institutions and to skew and transform the law, institutions, the state, everything to their own personal favor, and to help them satisfy their own interests, whatever those interests may be it financial, political, or otherwise. But to the extent to which that any major political force in the country, be it an armed militia or a powerful political group, if they have interests in the outcome of a specific case, then of course they're going to use that influence. There's no question.
Thank you. Anyone else want to tackle the issue of militias, the extent of militia involvement in the Iraqi justice system?
There's one specific point I'd like to make. Quite a few years ago, many within Iraq and in the international community were starting to raise concerns about impunity of security forces, and that included different units within both the military and Ministry of Interior forces, but then also popular mobilization forces over time. And what the response of the state was to create special judges or specialized judges who would sit in, the ones I've come across have been in the main courthouse in Baghdad, who would then become a judge specialized in that specific security unit. And my understanding at the time was that they were meant to be there to prosecute members of that unit, members of that group when they misbehaved. So there's a specific NSS, National Security Service judge. There's a Ministry of Interior Intelligence judge. And there are popular mobilization force judges. And I've actually met with two of them. And what I've discovered over time by engaging with them is that none of the cases that they are actually presiding over are about members of that institution or that security actor who are misbehaving, but instead now they've morphed their role, and they are the ones who these groups bring detainees to. So the PMF judges are presiding over cases where popular mobilization groups arrest individuals and want to prosecute them mostly on terrorism charges. Now, the real, there are many concerns that this raises, but one of the significant ones is that as far as we know, the popular mobilization forces have no legal mandate to be detaining, nor do many other actors within the government, including the National Security Service and others, according to what they've told us. And yet they have formalized within the courthouse in Baghdad a judge who presides over cases of people that they've detained. And these judges have told me, we have very friendly relationships with these armed groups. Don't worry, we know their tactics. So that's how we know that the cases they bring before us are credible. I think that's one very specific way in which groups like the Popular Mobilization Forces and others have been able to really infiltrate the judicial system and control the outcomes in cases where they are detaining individuals.
Bilkis, one of the things that you've actually looked into is the prevalence of secret prisons, secret detention centers in Iraq. It's absolutely, obviously, horrific conditions. Is that something that's been addressed, do you think, or do you still believe that there are prisons out there we don't know about where people who have been disappeared are being detained?
There absolutely are, and that's a direct consequence of, again, this reality where you have groups involved in detention who have no legal mandate to detain. Therefore, if they detain individuals, they aren't putting them in formal detention facilities that international organizations can have access to ensure certain standards and conditions, but also that the Iraqi High Commission for Human Rights can have access to. So these are facilities that are completely outside of that framework. And I've, over the years, spoken to many individuals who've been held in these types of facilities. Sometimes it's abandoned farm buildings. Sometimes it's houses that are about to crumble because they were hit by mortars during fighting, and now a single room with a hole in the roof is holding 300 people. I mean, these are absolutely, as you said, horrific conditions. And as long as you have a system where actors who have no right to detain are detaining, you're going to continue to have this problem of secret detention facilities. And of course, with that, you have the problem of enforced disappearances, because then there is no official structure that families can go to find their loved ones. And these people are at real risk of never, ever being turned over to the justice system and simply disappearing.
Thank you. Ahlam, there's a question from someone in the audience, Ataf Al-Khadouri, who asks, what specific obstacles do you think women in, so this is a question asking, what specific obstacles do you think women in particular face in trying to access justice in Iraq?
من النساء ممكن تعيد السؤال إذا أمكن؟
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. Regarding women, yes. What obstacles, what problems do they have accessing justice in Iraq? Are there specific problems for women in accessing the legal system?
بالحقيقة
As a matter of fact,
يواجهها النساء
the problems
والرجال
that women face and men face are similar. It's not that there are particular problems. I want to comment on that several factors detain people. I'd like to explain something related to that. May I?
استمر؟
Shall I go on and talk about that?
Yes, please.
بالفعل أتفق كثيرا.
Of course, I agree that the justice system in Iraq suffers from many problems because there are several actors that detain people. And this is a problem that Iraq has encountered after 2003. Before that, there was one entity that will detain people, and everybody knows what entity is that. And now there are many entities that detain people, and this is one of the main reasons why the justice system has been distorted. Because when someone is detained, it is difficult to find that person because there are many entities that may have detained that person. So it is the family of that person will start looking in several places or with several entities, and the person is quite often lost. The detained person is lost because nobody knows who detained that person. It could be the Minister of Interior, it could be the National Security, it could be the intelligence, it could be the Baghdad operations, it could be the People's Mobilization Front, it could be. So there is a distortion in the justice system in Iraq. When someone is detained, the family of that person should know where that person is detained, and he or she should get a lawyer, because now lawyers, and I'm one of them, when a family wants to assign a lawyer, they come to a lawyer, they go to a lawyer and ask, where is our son and or our daughter? And the lawyer, unfortunately, quite often, or some lawyers exploit these families, and they charge them very high amounts of money just to identify the location of where this person is detained. In Iraq, we have a problem related to that. Many actors are detaining people, and this is one of the most important issues that need to be worked on if we want to rectify the justice system in Iraq, is to unify, to have one accountable, responsible entity that is in charge of detaining people within the framework of law implementation. The justice in Iraq is lost. Uh, I was using a euphemism when I said that it faces problem. It is lost completely. So if we want to rectify the justice system in Iraq, if we want to reform it, we need to assign one entity that is in charge of detaining those who should be detained. And judges should issue orders for detainment, not like having a specific judge for each particular entity. So if somebody is detained and we don't know who detained him, then that person is practically lost. As for the problems that women face when they access the judicial system, I don't know if you want me to talk as a lawyer or as a citizen who may face a problem and need to access the judicial system. In Iraq, the problems that women face when they access the justice system, we as individuals, as women and as men, we face the same problems and we encounter the same procedures, same bureaucracy. There's no differentiation or no discrimination between women and men when they try to access women. Women are not lightly treated or more severely treated. They face the same procedures.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask all of you, each of you, about the protest movement. We saw young people, young Iraqis, going out for months and months, risking their lives, some of them losing their lives. And one of their main demands was a justice system they could believe in, a homeland with rule of law that worked for everyone. From what we've seen, I mean, Zaid, you've talked about a parliament that you don't believe will be much different. What did that protest movement achieve, if anything? And please don't say it didn't achieve anything. But no, be honest. What do you think it did?
Ahlam is asking, do you allow me to answer that?
Up to you, Jane. Tell me.
Of course, yes, each of you. I'd like each of you to talk about. Zaid, okay, did you want to go first, and then we'll go to Ahlam?
Okay. So, I say this with a huge amount of regret. It doesn't give me any pleasure to say this. Quite on the contrary, this is it's a tragedy of unspeakable proportions. Is that the protest movement so far hasn't achieved anything? Their goal, of course, their end goal was to achieve a new social contract in the country, right? Which would have to, involve social justice and involve the rule of law and involve a much more democratic way of governing. But their stated goal in the short term was a new electoral law. That was what they wanted. The reason why they said we prioritize elections over constitutional reform or institutional reform in the short term is because any constitutional or institutional reform that would take place in the short term would be carried out by the same parties that populate parliament currently, right? Which aren't interested in the slightest in redesigning the social contract for the interests of the individual Iraqi, the marginalized Iraqi, or people who've been struggling over these past few decades, right? But that's what they got. The first thing that happened as soon as the protest started was that the parliament and the government and everyone started putting together constitutional revision committees, which were then involved in the effort of trying to redesign institutions, and ultimately they stopped because the protest petered out. And then eventually they got to the business of rewriting the electoral law. And they did so in a way that, just sort of changes the districting a little bit. We're not exactly sure exactly how it's going to change ultimately, but we have an idea of what direction it's going to head in. But that's not an improvement. The previous districting, of the country wasn't good or bad. That wasn't, lots of countries have that system, and those countries do fine. And lots of countries have this new system as well, and those countries do fine. The countries that do badly are countries that don't have accountability systems, and that's what we're lacking, and that's what hasn't changed at all, right? So it's a real tragedy that things happen in the way that they did. But so far, if the protests aren't going to be rekindled, and if there isn't a new round that's going to bring with it real change, then they haven't achieved anything. And I hope that none of the listeners are living under the illusion that just because a few hundred people were killed, that's going to bring about change. That's nothing, sadly, not sadly, like tragically, unspeakably, but that's the reality. If you had been in Baghdad speaking to the leaders of the state while those poor people were being killed in the streets, while they're being shot in the face with gas canisters, et cetera, people would be shocked to realize that they didn't believe that there was anything to be fixed. The people in government think that everything is fine, and that actually people who are protesting have nothing really to complain about. That's how things happen in Baghdad. That's the way in which there's a huge disconnect. I think yesterday in another panel, Maria was saying that, Maria, formerly of ICG and currently of HD, was saying that people in the international community live in a bubble because they're stuck in the green zone. It's not just them. It's the Iraqi political elite that live in the bubble, and they really believe that Iraq is totally fine, that there are no real problems, right? And that if people are protesting, ultimately it's because either they're ungrateful or because they've been infiltrated, right? And if people have been killed, yes, perhaps in some cases it's tragic, right? But ultimately, some of those people weren't peaceful. So what can we do, right? That sort of thing. That's how the conversation happens in those circles. And I'm saying that based on, this is solid, right? So so I'm very, very sorry to come back to you and just say, so far nothing concrete.
Thank you. We'll go to Ahlam and then back to Balkis. Ahlam, in the protests and after the protests, there were so many protesters who were arrested, charged with terrorism, some of them still in jail. How is that being addressed?
بالنسبة
As
للمظاهرات اللي
for
حدثت
the
طبعا
protests that took
تكلموا
place,
قبل الزملاء
as
وأتفق
my
معهم
colleague has
كثيرا
said before,
أنه
and I agree
لم
with him
يتحقق شيء
in many
لأنه
points,
كانت
nothing
المظاهرات
was
قد
achieved
خرجت
because the
على
protests
المطالبة بالعدالة.
demanded justice,
والعدالة المطالب بها هي
and
ليست العدالة
the
القضائية
justice that
لكن
was
العدالة
demanded
المجتمعية
was not judicial
لأنهم
justice,
يشعرون
it
أنهم
was
في
social
بلد
justice.
لا يوجد فيه
People felt
تكافؤ
that they
للفرص.
live in a country where no equal opportunities are available.
ليس منتمي إلى حزب
And
معين وليست
those who
لجهة
are not
تدعمه
affiliated with
لا
a political
يستطيع
party, who are not
أن
supported,
تكون له
but who
وظيفة.
don't have connections, can
وبالتالي
even
كانت
get
المطالبة بأن
hired
تكون
to
هناك
get
تكافؤ
a
للفرص
governmental job.
والعدالة الاجتماعية.
So people
والعدالة
demanded social
الاجتماعية
justice,
في أن
and
تكون هناك رواتب
social justice
لا
requires
يكون
that
هناك بين شخص وآخر
no
هذا
discrimination should exist between people.
الفجوة الكبيرة
There
في
was
قيمة
a
الراتب.
gap
فهناك بعض الرواتب
in
قد
the
تصل
salary
إلى
system.
$5,000
Some
وهناك
people had
رواتب تصل
salaries that
إلى
amount to
$300.
$5,000, and some people took
هذه
salaries that
الفجوة
are
الكبيرة هي التي
about
جعلت من المجتمع العراقي
$300. This
للأسف
gap in the salary system
مجتمع
created a sense of injustice, and it
طبقتان فقط. كان
created
العراق سابقا
two
غير
classes in this,
كالطوابق، هي
two
الطبقة
social
الغنية
classes
والطبقة
in
الوسطى والطبقة
society.
الفقيرة.
In the past,
حاليا
there was
الطبقة
a
الوسطى
high class,
لا توجد هناك
financially
طبقة
speaking, high
وسطى
class, middle
وإنما
class,
فقط
and
هي
low
الطبقة
class.
الغنية
Now there's
وطبقة
only This is due to the gap that is growing between the Iraqi people. So the protesters demanded social justice. They demanded that when someone graduates from university, they get an opportunity to be fairly employed. Now the Iraqi people are losing hope, and that was the main reason for the protest. People wanted a future. They wanted to see a future for the next generations. And this hope was crushed among the Iraqi youth. As for the protesters, I will speak as a lawyer. As a lawyer, and me and my colleagues created teams to defend the protesters. And whenever a group of protesters was arrested, we went to get them released. And there was cooperation from the judicial system to release these protesters. Most accusations were the use of Molotov bombs and explosives. Some protesters who committed violence were, there was a WASPA incident where some protesters killed someone. They were sentenced, and the crime was documented in the media. Those who committed the crime were sentenced, but those who were not involved were released. And we as lawyers we participated we contributed to the release of many detainees. And as far as we know, no innocent protesters are still being detained.
Sorry, did you say no innocent protesters are still being detained?
نعم لحد الآن حسب المتظاهرين الأبرياء اللي لم يرتكبوا بس فقط كان سبب اعتقالهم بسبب المشاركة في التظاهرات لم يتبقى أي واحد منهم في السجون في الوقت الحالي حسب
none of them remained in prison as far as I know.
Belkis, I did want to ask you about a wider issue of this, but maybe you could address that specific point. It seems the justice system to me seems so opaque, it would be difficult to tell that there were not innocent protesters still detained. Do you have a view on that?
Well, what I can say for sure is that we do know there are some individuals, particularly leaders within the protest movement, who are currently disappeared. The problem is that we don't know who is holding them, and we don't know where they are. I mean, even this is by the government's own admission. The Prime Minister recently announced a special committee that was going to look into the whereabouts of one specific protest leader from southern Iraq who's been missing for many weeks now, and we know of others. In fact, at the moment there are, I think, 6 urgent complaints before the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances of the United Nations of people linked to the protests that are still missing, and these complaints have been transmitted by the UN to Iraq, and the UN is waiting for an answer as to where these people are. So I think this is still, unfortunately, an issue of real concern.
That's what we're best at, forming committees. We're great at that.
There are a lot of committees. There's an interesting question here, very briefly, because we have only 7 minutes left, unfortunately. It's from Muhammad Tawfiq Ali, who asks, will the COVID-19 pandemic mark the end game for Iraq's mass popular uprisings there? And perhaps more broadly, Zaid, has it had an effect, do you think, on reform efforts?
I can't see any link between COVID-19 and reform, not in Iraq at least. And if anything will bring an end to the protest movement, it isn't COVID-19, it's despair, you know. So I mean, COVID-19 might, you know, dissuade some people from engaging in protest because might be a little bit worried about catching the virus while they're participating in a protest. It might be used by the state as an excuse to disallow protests from taking place, but you know, so far those haven't been notable differences. You know, so far, I mean, the main reason why people are dissuaded from protesting isn't for fear of catching the virus. And I should probably say that there isn't a huge risk of catching a virus if you're protesting outdoors. It's not a significant risk. And COVID, generally speaking, isn't taken very, very seriously in Iraq as well. It's just like a minor problem in comparison to the other problems that we have. The main reason why the protest movement will die is because another generation will just wallow in despair and look to lead their lives elsewhere, look to leave and emigrate.
Thank you. We have just 5 minutes left. So really briefly, I wanted to touch on a question posed by Sam with no last name, who says he hopes we can come back to Belkis's bright spots. And I also wanted to ask Ahlam, in 2 minutes, if you could tell us, are there bright spots? What is it, do you think, is going well, is working in terms of reform in Iraq? Ahlam?
الجوانب المضيئة قليلة في
The bright
العراق
spots are very few in Iraq, unfortunately.
لكن ممكن
But
أنه نقول الجوانب
we can say that
المضيئة فقط في قانون الانتخابات
the
الحالي.
bright spots
قانون
are in the current
الانتخابات الحالي
elections
هو
law.
أكثر مسألة
The current elections
كان
law
ممكن أن تغير المستقبل العراق.
is
قانون
something that
الانتخابات
has the
اللي يتم
potential
تعديله في
to
الوقت
change
الحالي
the future
هو
in Iraq.
ممكن أنه راح يحد من حجم
It
الأحزاب
may reduce
حسب
the role of
ما
political parties,
عرفنا أنه
the
هذا
influence of
القانون راح
political
يحد من
parties,
حجم
because this
الأحزاب
law
ويحد من
will reduce
نفوذ
the
بعض
influence
الأحزاب وبالتالي
of some particular
المستقبل أو
parties,
البصيص
and
الأمل
hence
الحالي اللي إحنا
the
كنا
glimpse of
اللي
hope
نتصور
that
راح تكون
we
هناك
are trying
مشاركة واسعة
to
من قبل
see
العراقيين في
is to
الانتخابات
have wide
القادمة بسبب تعديل
participation from
قانون
the Iraqi
الانتخابات
people
الحالي.
in the
هذا
elections,
القانون اللي إذا ما تم
and this
تعديله
law,
سيكون
if
هناك
reformed,
فرصة
may
للمستقلين، الفرصة
give an
لبعض
opportunity for independent
الأشخاص
candidates
المنضمين
and
للأحزاب
for
في
some
الصعود
people
إلى
who are not
وإذا ما
affiliated with
تغير
political parties
البرلمان العراقي
to
الآن يعتقد
get
أنه
into the
هذا
parliament. And
إذا تغير
then
بأن
if we have that
يكون
change,
هناك برلمانيين
we
لا
may have
تقودهم الأحزاب
some
ولا تقودهم بعض
parliament members who
الشخصيات
are not led by the political
الطائفية،
parties
ممكن
and
أنه
who are not
يتم
led by sectarianism,
تعديل
then
كثير من الأمور في العراق.
many things can
الأمل فقط في
go for the
الانتخابات
better
القادمة إن شاء
in
الله.
Iraq. So we have hope in the next Iraqi elections.
Belkis, very quickly, one bright spot.
So I wanted to raise some developments we're seeing in the criminal justice system specifically. So about a year ago, if I'm getting the dates correct, maybe a little bit longer, there was the court north of Mosul in Tilkeif, which is the court handling the largest number of ISIS cases. And what had happened at that court, unlike elsewhere in the country where the vast majorities of trials of ISIS suspects are proceeding solely based on a confession, at this courthouse, because of their proximity to Mosul and their proximity to security forces that were raiding houses that had been used by ISIS, they came across a trove, terabytes and terabytes of hard disks with information about ISIS members, including their real names, their ISIS nom de guerre, and the roles that they had played within the organization. And what we saw was that pretty quickly, certain judges in the courthouse stopped relying on the confessions that were being provided to them, and instead only wanted to see cases proceeding where there was this additional evidence on an individual. And that to me, again, speaks to something I said earlier, which is, you know, the skill sets are there with judges, and it's really about the tools that they're being given and the framework within which they're working. And so while investigators in Iraq, generally speaking, do not have the training to conduct proper investigations, and instead think simply getting a confession is how you investigate a crime, here's a specific example where when more evidence was provided, judges were very happy to switch, in some cases, to relying on that other evidence. And just one last word, also in Mosul, there was a committee that was created earlier this year, and it was created expressly to handle the cases of juvenile suspects, and goes back to the question that was brought up earlier on concerns around how children are treated. This committee, and the head of the committee in particular, chose to take the international law approach and chose to amnesty and release dozens of children that were being tried by this specific committee. And that again was really positive to see that with the opportunity to do so, that this committee was doing so. The sad postscript to that story is that this committee has now been disbanded, and there's no sense that I've seen that the justice system is looking at the courthouse I mentioned, this committee that I mentioned, and really trying to learn from those examples and mainstream that across the rest of the judiciary.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, which is particularly sad since we have a lot of really great unanswered questions, but we can continue the conversation on the chat and networking option and Conference Plus for those who choose to. Thank you so much to the audience, and thank you so much to our panelists, Ahlam Alami, Zaid Al Ali, and Belkis Vile. Thank you, Chatham House, for this opportunity. The next session starts in 1 hour, and it will discuss the future of Iraq in the region. Thank you again.